There you
I'm
go.
cured.
How you doing?
What, are we the only ones here?
Yeah, you didn't go that to the meeting, I take it?
What?
You didn't go to our meeting, I take it?
Our meeting? No, I couldn't because of this. And my wife doesn't want me to drive that far. But
Yeah, I don't
um,
want to go that far either. That's why I didn't go. I really didn't.
uh,
It's too damn far. So and yeah, it's just too far, period. So yeah, either way. Yeah, I saw this. I figured I'd just listen and see what they had to say. Say hi to some old friends, stuff like that.
this one is just going to be a tour of the CD or something.
Just all open forum. I don't know, just gonna shoot the baloney, I guess. I don't know. I have no idea. Just see what's going on. I just want to see if I can get Al Foster to give me Goldwater's phone number because I want to talk to him because I haven't spoken to him in 30 years. I just love to shoot the baloney with him.
Did you remain a member of BAS Zoom?
Nah, no, I quit when I came down here.
Oh,
I like the Zoom things. It's nice I can see some of these old people. They don't even remember me. A couple of them do, but not
yeah.
30
Well,
years.
I should
30 years.
I should have a big article in the next BAS speaker. So I want to see if they talk about any of that.
I have
And
no idea. Oh, I just
did you,
tired of just sitting around. I got a new gizmo for my desktop system, little Fossy thingamajig, like the what do you call it? The Audio Crest Dragon. Their version of it's much cheaper, $60. And wow, what a difference it makes. I had the mono price one, had it a couple of years. It was pretty good. This thing, though, jeez, unbelievable difference.
what is it?
Fossy Audio.
What is the component? A DAC?
Not, yeah, it's a deck. It's a little deck. Yeah, there's the block.
Hmm. Okay.
So yeah, it works fine. I'm really, I got, I got some of my old NHT Super Zeros on there with a subwoofer, and they sound great.
Yeah, that's good. I was just shopping for a new keyboard because I got some sticky keys on mine, and I'm going to get one for $16.
God, it's
But
cheap.
going through Amazon, there's one for $914.
Must be
A
for gamers.
keyboard.
Must be for gamers. They're crazy.
Or audio files.
Uh, no, I got the keyboard that came with the PC, and it's fine. It works fine. I don't
Alvin,
like
what's
that.
up?
He's muted. Hey, Alan, can you hear us?
Sorry.
Alvin?
Yeah, I'm just sitting here waiting on everybody to come on board. And both of you are in Florida, no issues?
No, a little wet. That's about it. Hey, Alvin, I want to ask you a question before this thing starts. Can you give me Goldwater's phone number? I want to talk to him. I haven't spoken to him in like 30 years. Do you happen to have it?
Yeah.
How you been?
Fine. Gary, your article for the newsletter, you having some issues or no issues?
I was talking to David about it, so it's fine.
Everything going okay? I guess that's the question.
Yeah,
Okay, that's
we,
all.
we we talked it over and we settled on the way it's going to look now.
Okay, good.
Do you get the Audio Express magazine?
No.
It's got a great article about a company in Denmark. They're coming out with some headphones. The company is called Idun, Idun, and I could give you a link to their description of their headphones. It's kind of like a head tracking headphone that will enable us to listen to anything via Bluetooth on a headphone, and I'm hoping that it'll be just about the same as what I was trying to investigate with you about virtual reality. So that would be great if that was possible because if it has head tracking, the presentation stays out in front of you, external, and it gets rid of everything else in your system, including your room.
Well, bring that up during the meetings. It's an open meeting, so you can
Okay. Yeah.
What's that, an Oculus?
It's a headphone electronic. You know the BACCH system for binaural virtual reality sort of stuff, Lenny?
No, I don't. I have an Oculus 2 here that I play with. It's a lot of fun, but virtual reality.
Oculus, yeah. And Apple is the third one, right?
Oh yeah, lots and lots of money.
Yeah. But Alvin and I are hoping that a headset like that could substitute for an entire audio-visual system for folks like us that have to be
incarcerated.
assisted living.
Yeah.
No substitute for the real thing. I'm sorry.
I applied for a demo set of the eDune, but they haven't written back to me yet.
Yeah, okay. Bring that up because obviously this is an open meeting. We don't have a so-called guest like we typically do. So
Yeah, okay.
bring that up and see what interest we get. So
Yeah.
how did you guys escape the Florida? Because you guys aren't on the Gulf? Helena, I guess is the name.
We're inland, both of us.
Oh.
I guess the West Coast, all the way up and down the West Coast, got some flooding from the storm stirring up the water, but that's about it for us.
It was really, really bad, the storm surge. I've been, keeping track of it. They said it was the worst they ever had, without a direct, even worse than a direct hit, believe it or not, where we are. And the poor people that up north where it hit, oh my God, they got 20, 25 dead people from this thing already. It was brutal. And there was so much rain on the last one, ideally, of it. Where I live, the place is so flooded, it's still, recovering from that one. And then we got this the other day. It's unbelievable.
So you two Florida people don't have your house insurance increased.
Yeah, we have house insurance after this. Every time there's a storm, the insurance companies go booking. Getting out of here.
Trying to look up that darn eDune system. Oh, I know it's in the advanced newsletter.
No.
Well, what's a company to do? Their expenses are going through the roof. They are losing money or going to be losing money. If they stay there, if they don't increase their rates, they're out of business.
Right. And they're forcing, I think, Citizens, which is the state-owned company, if I have this right, are forcing people that don't need it to buy flood insurance. People on hills, they still make them, buy flood insurance. It's unbelievable.
Well, that increases the pool of people who are paying into the system. I can understand it. I don't necessarily agree with that, but.
Well, I think I'd like an investigation as to how much the insurance company are profiting off of these storms. I know just in auto insurance, we all know how that varies by section of a region or whatever. And some states have controls to monitor the auto insurance companies, but I don't know how it works with house insurance.
I don't think there are any controls. I really don't. Could be wrong, but I don't think so.
Well, the company financial reports should be public, should they not?
I suppose so.
If they're a stock company, yes.
Very few are not. Very few insurance companies are private, I think.
Well, private companies don't have to reveal their books, isn't it? Some
Right, but
about it.
I think I would guess that most insurance companies are public companies. Anyway, I mean, you can look up your insurance company, whoever it is, and maybe whoever owns them and whoever owns them, and because they all bought and sold all the time, right? Uh, I mean, if you can get the financial reports, you'll know about their profits.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the way it is.
So, Gary Eichmeyer, got your ears on?
Sir. Yeah, I'm just distracted by looking through my emails to find something to show at the meeting.
Oh,
Well,
good.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
Did you get an invitation to join the Boston Audio Society groups.io?
Yes, I'm in there.
I was surprised to see, let's say, a discussion or a war, almost a flame war, about your ideas, speaker placement, not taking place on groups.io.
Oh, you want us to start up in there? No, it was kind of a private discussion between Moran and me.
Okay, you're allowed to have private discussions. It just seemed to me, from my opinion, that's a thing of wide interest, and it's something that if you cared to make it public, maybe you don't, could be done on groups.io. Just
Well, let me put it this way. One of us is right.
a,
I don't want to embarrass anybody or start an argument that nobody can win or be a troublemaker.
it's your call. It's just I thought in as a if it's a genteel public discussion of scientific interest to audio, that groups.io is a good forum for that kind of thing, and it allows for people who are interested to watch or chime in or whatever. People who are not interested will ignore it, and
Yeah.
but it is your choice solely. I'm glad to know that you got an invitation, anyways.
Okay, I'll talk it over with David and see. But
Sure.
it's an extremely interesting audio topic that has to do with how sound propagates into a room at low frequencies and at high frequencies.
Yep.
It works a little bit differently. And there was a drawing, but you know the Siegfried Linkwitz drawing of the corner of a room with it's all mirror surfaces and a picture of a speaker and how it reflects.
Yep.
That's a pretty famous drawing from Linkwitz.
Yep.
And David has a drawing from Harry Olson from 1950 that shows something similar, but it's from a slightly different angle of discussion. And I began to study both drawings, and I figured out what is going on between them that causes confusion for everybody. So I'm trying to think up an article for Audio Express to talk about it.
Yep. That's cool. I know a long time ago, I read the Linkwitz articles, and I'm not claiming I understand it in complete detail, but they convinced me to move or adopt or whatever panel type speakers, which
Uh-huh.
being dipoles, that's how I use them, have less side and actually up and down radiation as well. Uh, and so they put less energy into the room, and more of it is direct energy. If I remember Linkwitz, it's by 5 dB or so. I may be wrong about that. And
Between what?
sorry?
Between what? 5 dB between the front and rear?
No, there's 5 dB less reverberant energy put into a room by a dipole panel speaker than, let's say, a box speaker, omnipolar or whatever you want to call it,
Less.
monopolar.
The dipole speaker puts the sound out equally front and rear. How can there be less?
Because it radiates less to the sides. There's cancellation at along the plane of the diaphragm. You can
That's
find this.
a good area of discussion too.
Yeah, you can find this on Linkwitz's site. It's still there. So I liked what I heard. As to placement, I haven't gone into your paper in detail. I'm still trying to chew it up. Uh,
Which
I
paper?
well, your discussion of the reflection way of positioning speakers.
Yeah.
Um, I'm still trying to digest it. I found I think it was Audio Critic, a long time ago, an article by a guy whose name I'll probably mangle, called Rasnake, Rasnake, I think, who came up with an interesting observation that if you plot all of the different modes of the room, you can find places where there's the most interference, there's the least interference, if you will, with the originating sound, and it comes out basically to 1 over a prime number. The position a speaker a third of the way into the room, if you will, or a fifth or a seventh, and you get more flatness of the response. And it's an interesting article to
All
read, and
right.
I
All
agreed
right.
with his
Well,
conclusions. And that's not necessarily all, but that's where my speakers tend to end up when I move them around and try and listen for better sound and stuff.
okay, but once again, they're talking about only frequency response. They never seem to understand spatial response. Do you know what I mean by spatial response?
Do you mean time response?
No. Sound fields in rooms have spectral, spatial, and temporal characteristics
Yep.
in all rooms for live performance or playback. And all audiophiles seem to understand is frequency response. They talk about moving speakers around in a room with respect to frequency response, SBIR, and all that crap. But that's not what I want them to look for. I want them to look at the spatial. When you move something closer or farther from a reflecting surface or the corner of a room, or anywhere you move it, you can have a different spatial impression, and it's caused by the combination of the direct and early reflected sound. And um, what else about that? If you move it closer to the corner of a room, it diminishes the spatial response because it concentrates all the sound in clusters in the corner of the room, and that's what I want people to learn about, and what I'm trying to write about. Anybody else? Does that make sense?
Uh, and how do you measure spatial sound?
It's something that can't be measured, only heard.
Well, one thing I will just interject is not necessarily my only criteria, but is it Sean Olive at Harmon? Is that
Yeah,
is that a coherent reference?
yeah.
Okay. He determined maybe you say this is colored by Harmon's priorities or whatever. I think he's not wrong. He determined that, frequency response is one of the primary things that we respond to when we're listening. So I chose that, and the spatial thing I experiment with, and I get a certain amount of results, and never enough. But I'm also going to be experimenting with the time thing. There's a technique, and I think a box or a tool or whatever called Dirac, which
Yeah.
basically you measure your room, and you're going to be measuring the room, the speaker with the reflections and all that kind of stuff. And Dirac deconvolves all of that and creates a I'm going to say a curve, but not really an impulse response or an anti-impulse response or whatever. It fixes a lot of those kind of things.
Yeah, I just hope they're not trying to remove all the reflected sound in my room.
Well, this is just some technique I'm going to try to experiment with. I don't know that it's the answer. I know a couple of people who use it and who swear by it.
You guys ever try to figure out from all the YouTubers how to do room correction with Dirac and all the rest of them?
To figure out from YouTubers? No.
It seems to get very expensive if you want to do more than stereo, because they have boxes and measurements and versions for stereo installations, but you have to spend about 5 times as much for a surround sound multi-channel Dirac installation.
That
I'm trying to figure the whole thing out and put it in simple terms. What you got to buy, and how do you stick it into your system in order to get multi-channel Dirac?
okay. Well,
But the answer is the simplest way to do it is to buy a receiver that has Dirac in it, and then it can measure your room and save those settings in the receiver for everything that you play.
that's fine and true. I sorry, I should have pref, prefaced my talking by saying I'm a two-channel guy. I
Oh,
don't
well,
I don't do this for multi-channel. I'm only talking two-channel. And my solution of choice at this time would be the mini DSP two-channel Dirac, which was $400, something like that. And it's
yeah.
because I'm price sensitive. I'm cheap, as New England audiophiles are supposed to be.
Yeah, well, you can listen to music in a number of ways, but if you want to go for ultimate realism and movies and stuff, multi-channel is the new paradigm.
Yeah, if you want to go for that stuff, yeah, true. I'm a little shy of the expense of doing that. I've seen that it's rather expensive. I agree with you.
And mine is just 5.1, and it sounds pretty good.
Yeah, I have a home theater system. It's 5.1, and it's good enough for me. Sounds pretty good.
Oh, well, then you're multi-channel too.
Well, I don't listen to music on it. When I listen to music, it's two channel.
Well, shame, shame.
Well,
I'm not trying to monopolize here. Where's the meeting? Is
sorry.
Who's running the meeting?
I
Tim
suppose
Wax, right?
maybe I am. I don't know. Uh, the,
Really, your conversation. It said, I think, that Ken Waxer's doing it.
No, Nick is in charge. It's an open forum, so you weren't monopolizing. You're just open forum. But
I'm
I do have,
foruming.
huh?
I'm foruming.
Right. But I do have a couple of things to mention. One is the show. We all remember that from Vegas and other places. T period, H period, E period. Enterprises, the owner of the longest running hi-fi show, The Show, has acquired the New York audio show from the Chester Group. Under the new ownership, the renamed and reimagined event, the New York Audio International Audio Show, will carry on the tradition of showcasing ultra high-end audio solutions to audiophiles in the Eastern Seaboard, October 24th through 26th. So the only thing I couldn't find was, where is this going to be held? Does anyone know? David, do you know anything about that?
No. Never heard of this organization.
The show? Okay.
No.
I'd heard of them, but they disappeared. They were maybe initially associated with CES.
Sure.
Co-hosted at CES a long time ago, but then they went to California and then they disappeared for a few years. They stopped putting on shows, in other words. So they're back. I'm a little surprised.
I'm surprised, and I'm surprised, and in their announcement, they didn't mention where the show was.
Yeah.
The location. I mean, Eastern Seaboard is a little bit wide. Maybe Tom Parazola knows. Do you know anything about the show in October there, Tom?
You mean the CAF show? Capital Audio Fest?
No, don't know about that.
This one seemed to be New York.
Oh, New York, I don't know anything about it.
Okay. Okay. Well, that kills that one. I have another announcement. I think I might have mentioned it before, but some of you will remember Sandy Bloomberg. All of you remember the stores he ran or owned, Tweeter.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, Tweeter at one point had 130 something stores throughout the country. Anyway, he died recently, and his obituary was is on the web, so you're welcome to check it out. He
Put it in the chat.
well, he died September 3rd. I thought he graduated from Boston University, but he didn't. That's where I first met Sandy. And interesting thing, he all defined him as a very likable, well-respected guy. I thought he created a lot of enemies, but not really. He was nice to everybody, I gathered, judging by his obituary. So that's a good guy. I liked Sandy. He was always fair, a good talker. I was sorry to see that, but anyway, he leaves his wife of 40 years and 2 children, and 4 grandchildren. Anyway, he was a good guy, and I'm sorry to see him go.
There you go.
Feinstein, we all aware of that. That was announced before. His wife was going to send me a list of his equipment, but I haven't received it yet. So it gets back to the issue that Hadaway brought up before, is that how do we handle people who want us to help them with their audio equipment left over by their deceased partner.
Audio estates.
Audio estate, yeah, you can call it that. It's always an uncomfortable thing, because I think most people that are left thinking that their equipment is going to be worth a lot of money. But
audio is a very solitary hobby, isn't it?
That super rich guy, I can't remember his name, Fisher maybe, who passed away and had $1 million system. He only got 150,000 maybe.
Ken Fritz?
Yeah, Fritz. Yeah,
that's it. He only got like 15% of what he thought it was worth, or something like that. So yeah.
The lesson to be learned from that is, don't put your retirement money into audio gear or computer gear.
Right.
Speaking of computer gear, my 10-year-old laptop just started to go haywire the other day where the display wasn't working properly. I was still able to use it with an external monitor, but it was time to get a new one. But as usual, there are always problems because on the laptop was an application called No Machine. As you know, all of my equipment is down in the basement. And so in order to work with that equipment, I have this application called No Machine, which allows you is essentially is a remote desktop application. And it was connected to the desktop PC that was running Rune Bridge, the interface between the Rune nucleus and my Danville DSP unit, and also was running Audio Weaver, which used to set up all the parameters for the Danville unit. Somehow, during all this conversion, it screwed up my Rune Bridge on that unit. And the Danville would work if I fed an analog signal in, but not with a USB signal. And so I took the easy road out. Instead of trying to troubleshoot it, I just loaded a new version of Rune Bridge and it works fine. So all the fun of working with computers.
Yeah. A simple solution turns out to be a headache.
Well, the system I have is very complicated because the front end is Rune, which links to my NAS and also Cobuzz and other sources. And that feeds the Rune Bridge because Rune says you don't get the best results by using their USB output, which I was doing originally. So then I got this other PC to work as the Rune Bridge and the Danville unit. And, I'm a beta tester for that. And it's an absolutely wonderful unit. But they came out with a new processor board, which has over twice the processing power. They sent me the board, and I put the board in, and it worked fine with analog, but there was a bug with the USB. So instead of having me load new firmware, they sent me another board, and it was the higher speed processor, and I was just about ready to put it in. And they call me and says, don't do it. We found another bug. We'll let you know. And so I didn't waste my time putting that one in. I'm working with the original processor, which is wonderful, except I'm at about 93% of capacity. And so I'm just waiting now to see what they do. But that's the life of a beta tester,
Got some fancy processor too, right? Like the Storm Audio, or what is it? What is it?
This is from I think it is from Analog Devices. And it's a very high-speed processor. When I put it in, my usage dropped from 93% down to about 44%, except it didn't work with USB. So, so I put the old one back
your
in.
multi-channel processor.
Yes, that's correct.
I guess I'm confused.
Yeah, the processor is Analog Devices, and the four stereo DACs, because it's an 8-channel unit, are the Velvet Touch from AKM, which are really, really good DACs. They have a newer version of that DAC out, but I'm not going to try to install that till I get the other problems worked out. It is, by the way, in my opinion, the Danville unit is the best DSP processor I've ever had. Better than the DEQX, better than all the other processors that I've had.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, all of them, I can only suggest if you get involved with any of them, including Mini DSP, that you try to find somebody to help you because it's not an easy situation to work with all of the functions that the DSP units out there now are capable of.
Yeah.
I do some of the simpler stuff like time alignment and, parametric EQ, but the fundamental setups are way too complicated for me. By the way,
I've been trying to
go ahead.
I've been trying to go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that the guys at Danville want me to write something up because a lot of people do a time alignment and there's all kinds of different applications and everything. And I found the best way to do time alignment where you've got a multi-channel system with multiple drivers is you take and you build yourself a little pulse generator. I have a NE555 pulse generator that I made that puts out about 100 millisecond pulse. You know, it's a monostable, so just one pulse. And I go into each channel independently in it. For example, I'll go to the left tweeter and I will send the pulse out, and I've got a dual channel scope so that the original pulse goes to one channel and then the pickup from the amplifier, or from the speaker rather, goes to the second channel. So I have the reference to the first channel, which is the pulse coming out, and the second channel is the acoustic feedback from, let's say, the first tweeter. And I record that time. And then I do the same thing with like the mid-range.
It's the acoustic response?
The acoustic response.
Okay.
And you know there are going to be delays. So that's why you put in as a reference the original signal, because that will be the same for all of the channels. And you can compare the difference between all of the channels and the original signal. And then you just work with the difference between all of the channels, taking out that inherent lag that's for all of the channels. And then you can go in and set it very precisely. So it determines the time delay and obviously the phase as well, because you can see the phase right on the scope.
This pulse, I'm assuming, contains all frequencies.
It's a square wave that's 100 milliseconds long. So essentially it's got everything from 10 hertz up to almost infinity, depending on the rise time of the pulse generator, which is nanoseconds. So it does
Tom,
have
I've got
all
a
the
problem
frequencies.
with that.
Yeah, what's that?
You don't want the direct sound and all of the reflections from the room to arrive at the same time. The reflections should arrive later and from different directions.
That's not a problem because all you're looking at is the initial sound that's reaching the scope. Yeah, there's all kinds of stuff that comes later. You just want to check the initial time from the scope, which will be the first direct sound. Any of the reflected sounds will be later. So you have a beginning rise time for each channel, and that's what you use to set your time delay. And you disregard all the following stuff. There's all kinds of stuff that comes later. What you're worried about is just the initial delay from each driver going to the microphone, which is placed where I'm sitting.
You want all
Driver-
the drivers to be coherent.
I want all the drivers to be in phase and time aligned. Yes.
All the drivers of one speaker.
Yeah, but you do one speaker, one driver at a time, then you go to the next speaker and you measure the same thing. And you will set your time alignment so that all of them reach the listening position. The uptake reaches the listening position at the same time.
Are we
That
both
is-
talking about a multi-channel system or just stereo?
Just stereo, but you could do it with a multi-channel system too, but you'd have to go through each driver on each channel independently. I'm more interested in making sure that the drivers in a particular speaker are time aligned. And then when you start talking about time alignment between different drivers, then that's an additional step. But I'm only working with stereo, but the same concept of sending a pulse out holds true for however many channels you want.
I have a question about that procedure.
Sure.
Have you ever gone through the procedure for, let's say, a single loudspeaker and then moved the measurement microphone, let's say 6 inches in any direction, including up and down?
Oh,
and
it
looked at the
changes.
result?
Yeah, it changes. I mean,
How much does it change?
Depends on the inches.
Yeah, it depends on how far. And that's why I set the microphone exactly where my head is. And if you go to a different position, obviously, you're going to get a difference between the left and the right speaker. However, if the vertical position of the driver is the same, it should be the same for all the drivers in that speaker. But the relationship between the two speakers is going to change. Well, let me put it to you this way. In my speakers, which the drivers are in a vertical line, You've got two 12-inch woofers for the bass and a 5-inch mid-range, and then a beryllium tweeter. They're all in a line vertically. So that if you change anything in the vertical direction, that will change the time alignment. If you go horizontally, well, there's a slight setback on the driver, so it might change somewhat, but it won't change as much as a vertical distance.
Got it. Right. That
Yeah.
sounds like what one would expect.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a compromise. You have to pick a spot, because if you move, I mean, with anything, if you have speakers anywhere, if you move the listening position, the parameters are going to change. That's the laws of physics, you know?
Sure. The other thing I wanted to know, as I understand it, and this really isn't my area that I've studied particularly, but as I understand it, the people, humans, integrate what arrives at their ears over some number of milliseconds rather than simply responding to the first arrival. And in the number that is in my thinking is 10 to 15 milliseconds. Somebody could correct me if that's way off.
I don't go by that. In other words, within the first 5 milliseconds, we clamp down after that. But the first 5 milliseconds is the
Sorry, Brooklyn. The reason I'm asking is that if it does seem to me that your method is just looking at first arrival.
Correct.
Even if our hearing responds to a longer period of time, and that reflections in a relatively small listening room could well fall into that interval of time.
Correct. And that's something that you're going to have an almost impossible job to correct for electronically. If you, let me see if I can pick up my laptop. And if you look at my room with all the room treatments that are here, in my opinion, the answer to that is treat the room. The room is, people talk about the 800-pound gorilla in the room. The room is the 800-pound gorilla.
Agreed.
So first thing you want to do is get the speakers, the drivers in the speakers time aligned. And then secondly, you want to work with the room. You need to do both. They're not mutually exclusive. I've tried to do room corrections electronically, and you can do certain things, especially if some of your room problems are very low Q. But if you have a high Q problem, like a suck out in a room, you can put all the power you want into the speakers, and whatever is causing the cancellation is just going to cancellate the higher power. Yeah. So you really need to treat the room. And then at the low frequencies, what I did is I put in distributed subs to take care of some really nasty suck outs I had. To try to do it electronically in the original driver is not going to work. It's a fool's errand.
Yeah, EQ doesn't work.
EQ can work to some degree, especially if you have a really low Q problem. You can sort of, muscle your way in. But if you've got high Q, especially high Q suck outs, you're lost doing it electronically. I've done it. Doesn't work. And I'm driving 6.5 kilowatts into the system. So I don't care how much power you have. More power you put in a speaker, the more the cancellation is just going to cancel it. But if it's a very low Q, very broad, you can sort of muscle your way in a bit. The best way to do it is still get the right position of the drivers in the room for the mids and the highs, and deal with the low frequencies with distributed subs. That was I've got a couple articles out there in Audio Express if you go out and look. One is on the room treatments, and the other was on the distributed subs I did. Both of those have been written up. They're out there.
In Audio Express, right?
Yes, that's correct.
I've seen them. They're good. Very good.
And I the way Tom did his time alignment is the same way I did my time alignment, because we both started out with the EQX, which is the principal way they work, or one of the main ways they work. And Tom's moved on to that. What's the name of it?
The Nexus, the Danville Nexus, DSP Nexus.
And we will
the-
have them as guests in the future. We've talked to them.
The functionality of those two units, by the way, is pretty much the same. The difference is it's like anything else. The DEQX units were very old and the processors were very old, and the Danville unit is newer, and it's just like my 10-year-old laptop that just died compared to my new Dell. I mean, there's no comparison in the processors. That's just computer world. But as far as the functionality, they sort of do the same thing. And the DACs in this new Danville unit are the AKM Velvet Touch, which are better than the DACs that were in the DEQX, which were far better than the DACs that were in the Behringer stuff. It's just progress, you know.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Yeah.
Danville continues to develop this art.
Yeah, they're very good. They started off with doing all kinds of signal processing. That's why it's called Danville Signal, and they got involved in the audio business for music and stuff by building a lot of stuff for speakers that have built-in DSP, and they sold a lot of modules to speaker manufacturers. And the Nexus is one of their first general, high-end products, and it's like I said, it's still in beta. And I expected warts in a beta unit, and I certainly found them, but it works just magnificently. Even, I'm just waiting until they get all the bugs out. It's not quite ready for prime time. It still has some work to be done, but that's a new product, and they're smart enough not to say that it's ready for prime time. It's still
You're
a beta.
on camera here. Cover yourself up.
Pardon?
Nothing.
Okay. By the way, if you're going to work on a beta unit, I don't care what it is, you better have a lot of patience, because every beta test I've taken part in, you're going to have problems. Nobody's smart enough to figure everything out ahead of time. And if they tell you they have, don't buy a used car from them.
Can I ask, this is Nick Rodenhouse. Can I ask sonically, what's the difference between time aligned and not time aligned? What are you listening for when I'm saying using your ears and not your oscilloscope? What are you listening for?
Nick, what it has to do is also based on the slopes that you have in your crossovers. If you have very broad slopes in the crossovers, the time alignment is not so critical, because the drivers, for a large part of their, let's say you got a 6 dB per octave, for a large part of their crossover area, you're getting sound from both speakers, so it sort of integrates between them. However, that sort of integration is sort of like homogenizing the sound. And if you have very steep slopes, by the way, if you're going to have steep slopes, you better have drivers that have the same radiation pattern in the crossover range, because if you don't, and you have and I've done this, I had some drivers that did not have the same radiation pattern. I had very steep slopes. And what happens is your room contribution changes as you go through the crossover frequency. And if the radiation pattern is different, it really mucks up the imaging. And like if you take a voice, and the voice is going through the crossover region, part of the voice is coming from one space and part of it's coming from another, because some of it's direct and some of it's, has a high content of reflected sound. So getting back to your question though, if you have steep slopes and you time align the drivers, what happens is the shape of the waveform, excuse me, is preserved closer as you go through the crossover points, because the positioning of the driver, let's say as part of the waveform, is kept so that the waveform looks closer. If they're not time aligned, let's say your tweeter is way forward, you're going to get part of that high frequency signal reaching you before the mid range or the bass is reaching you. And what that does is it sort of it sort of messes up two things. It messes up the sense of space, because that's very critical. Timing is very critical on the sense of space. And it also tends to what I call texture in the music. And if you have very complex sounds like brass or a chorus with a lot of voices, if everything is time aligned, you can tell, for example, in the voices, you can separate the voices out a little bit better. If you have brass, you can separate the brass out, the individual brass instruments a little bit better. So it gives you a little bit more sense of definition between the instruments of the voices. And the other thing, your sense of space, let's say at a live performance, is somewhat determined by the direct reflections and the delay of the reflections, the direct sound and the reflections coming off the listening space. And if you do that, and you can maintain a time-aligned system, what happens is that subtle information of the reflected sound from the room does not get stepped on by a delayed signal from one of the other drivers if they're not time aligned. It's very hard to describe, but it's like they say, if you hear it, you'll know it.
So you're saying that the acoustic waveform fidelity is higher when you have high crossover slopes, high order crossover slopes, and you've time aligned the drivers.
The higher crossover slopes, the greatest benefit for that, I hate to answer like a politician, but let me back up a little bit. If you have higher crossover slopes, you'll get less of a particular frequency coming from both drivers at the same time. And what happens is if you have, if you have that, you'll wind up with comb filtering between the drivers, and that's a problem. Secondly, it's hard to maintain the fidelity of a signal if part of the frequency of that signal, let's say you take a cymbal strike, if the initial strike is coming at a different time of the follow-on shimmer. So the closer you can get time alignment and the better you can get with separation of the signal going to the drivers. Again, very critical, assuming that the radiation patterns are the same through the ranges, then the closer you're going to get to the sense of texture and space in the sound. And again, if your room is not treated, it all goes to shit pretty quickly because the early reflections in a room step on everything.
Yeah, I think what Tom was saying is they're not time aligned. I mean, sharp slopes anyway. Their greatest contribution is probably to power handling. Tom, would you agree?
Yeah, but I don't consider that my number one category. That's true. If you separate the frequencies out into different power amps, you're less likely to get IM distortion. But we're not talking about a 30-watt tube amp now. I've got 6.5 kilowatts of amps, so that people say, well, what happens when they clip? They never clip. They don't even get close to clipping.
Mainly to the drivers, your speakers can
Pardon?
go. I refer mainly to the speakers so they can go louder without distortion.
Oh, without a doubt, but you can do that. You could do that passively, but the higher, actually, realistically, once you get past 12 dB per octave, if you are at a 12 dB per octave slope, as you go below the crossover point, you will get no more excursion than you get above the crossover point. If you have 6 dB per octave, you continue to get excursion below that point. And that's why 6 dB per octave slopes put a lot of strain on drivers, because even when you go below the crossover, the excursion is still increasing. But once you get above 12 dB per octave, when you get below the crossover point, you get no more excursion. So that if you can handle the excursion with the 12 dB per octave slope, you don't gain any more speaker protection by going up to, let's say, a 48 dB per octave slope. What the
There's
48 dB per octave slope does, or 96 or whatever. By the way, if you go to really high slopes, you better have some serious processing. If you're at 48 dB per octave slopes, what it means is there's virtually no sound from the mid-range, let's say, for example, getting into the tweeter or the woofer, so that as you go through the crossover, you don't get lobing. When you have 6 dB per octave slopes, as you go through the crossover, the multiple drivers are contributing, and you will, if you look at if you do a vertical, let's say if they're vertically aligned and you do a vertical analysis, you will see a vertical, like a fingerprint of the lobing. And that goes away with the higher slopes.
Yeah. Now there is a sonic advantages for some when they, should we say, use 6 dB per octave. You get more of that spacey, airy, out of phase kind of phasey kind of a sound. And some people
It's like having a single end of 300V tube amp that has a lot of even order harmonics. It may create a sound that you like, but it's not at all accurate. And if you have low slopes in your crossover, it's hard to get the time alignment that's necessary for what I call this texture, or the ability to separate the subtleties in the different instruments or voices, and the ability to reproduce the original hall.
Well, one thing is with first order slopes, 6 dB, if the drivers are up to it, because the response falls off so slowly, if the drivers are up to it, their acoustic response sums to unity. So you do get an in-phase signal across the spectrum, across that crossover.
That is correct. However, that's assuming a passive crossover. However, with the active
it will be true with an active crossover as well. Sorry.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is the advantage that you get with 6 dB per octave is mainly an advantage with a passive crossover. With an active crossover, you can deal with the phasing, you can deal with the time delays, you can deal with all of that with a higher slope.
That's not quite true. The sum is not unity.
Explain to me what you mean by the sum is not unity.
The waveform out of the speaker with a first order crossover is the same as the waveform in if the drivers are, let's say, perfect.
I don't know that, I've never done that, so I can't say for sure.
I've derived it mathematically. I mean,
realistically, if you have two drivers, they're separated by a distance, and you have a first order slope, you're going to get comb filtering. And with a higher order slope, you get rid of the comb filtering, and you can set the time alignment. You can make sure the phase is correct. And I have not put a square wave through a first order passive and then through my system, but I can tell you what I hear with the system, with it all time aligned and everything, sounds more detailed and realistic than what I hear with the 60. I used to have 6 dB per octave slopes, and I'm just not a big fan of those.
Yeah, you solve different problems with, say, a first order crossover than higher order and time aligning and all the things that you do. But the fact remains that the sum of a low pass and a high pass of first order is unity. That's all. I'm not saying that's a better solution.
When you say unity, do you mean unity in terms of amplitude?
I mean unity in all ways. Amplitude, phase, you name it. The sum
how can it be true of phase?
As a transfer function.
I got a question, Tom. If you have the ability to see the difference in the arrival times on your scopes between tweeters, mid-range, and woofers, you can see that they are either aligned or not, right?
Correct. And if they're in phase or not.
Then you have the ability to see how audible those factors are if you vary them. So if you can change the time of arrival of tweeter, mid-range, and woofer, then you can tell how far out of line they have to get in order to become audible, right?
You probably could. I've never done that because I'm not trying to find out how bad I could make it. I'm trying to find out how good I can make it by getting them aligned. And I
But you
can tell you
claim that you can hear it when it's right.
oh, you can definitely hear it when it's right. And I don't know how far out of alignment it has to be before you hear it. I've never gone in that direction. Why would I want to, I'm not trying to be a professor of audio technology. I'm trying to get the sound right. And I know if they are time aligned, then the sound is right.
Well, I was just thinking in regard to David Satz's question and observation. Is he still here?
Yeah.
He said if the first arrival is within about 8 to 10 milliseconds, I think it's a little higher than that. But if that's the case, then it all unifies as the first arrival. And anything later than that, a lot later than that, is heard as an echo. And I think that's about right. How
But
can a
that's not
misalignment
what
of drivers so small be that audible?
that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the difference between a initial sound and an echo or an ambience. I'm talking about the ability to maintain the separation of the small details in the music. And I can tell you when they are time aligned. I've had lots of people come in here from different places, different men, women, rank amateurs to advanced listeners. And one of the consistent things they've all said, like in May, the New Jersey Audio Society had their meeting here. And there was one woman who goes to an awful lot of live music. And she walked into the room and was listening to this. And she said, this is the first time I've heard a system where it sounds like the people are right there. And I can tell the difference between all the individual instruments and voices. There's a definition there that I've never heard before. And part of that, well, it's a lot of things. It's the room, it's the drivers, but it's also the time alignment. And I believe the high crossover slopes to get rid of the lobing.
Nick, did we answer your question? Nick?
Is that this Nick or yeah, I guess I'm not Nicholas.
Right in the house.
Yes, but I had a follow-up question, and that was to what extent can you deal with time alignment by the physical positioning of the different drivers?
You can do the same thing. It's a lot harder to do it physically. It's a lot easier to sit down with your computer and just put in the time delays. But you are correct. And you look at some of the speakers, like some of the Wilson speakers and some of the others have actually done that. The disadvantage of doing it, which is probably not a real life major disadvantage, but if you do it physically, and then let's say you change your vertical position where you're sitting and listening, well, you got to go back and change the physical position of the drivers. Where if you do it with DSP, it's just a different number. But you are correct. You could do the same exact thing with physical positioning for a particular listening position as you can do with DSP for a given listening position.
Could you use your approach to calculate the physical difference between the tweeter, the mid-range, and the woofer? And then, I build speakers. So then I would say, aha, I need X number of millimeters between the, I don't know what, cone, I don't know what part of the speaker I have to be concerned about.
You have to find the acoustic center of each of the drivers. And again, I don't worry about that because I'm just looking at the resulting signal that's reaching the microphone. But you are correct. You would have to go in there if you're designing a speaker. You would have to take, and if you're going to do that, I would use the same technique with a pulse and a microphone and measure what you're getting out of that speaker, and then take the next driver, and you can either calculate it if you know the acoustic center, but it's easier just to move it back and forth if you're in design phase, measure it, and then do it with the other driver, and then you could nail that down. However, that is going to be dependent on two things. It's going to be dependent on how far the ears are of the listener above the floor, because you've got the speakers, I'm assuming, sitting on the floor or on stands, and then how far back you are. Because if you do the trig and you look at the different positions, as you move closer and further back, the relationship of the differences is changing. Just draw it on a piece of paper and you can see. So, yeah. Wait, let me finish. So if you're going to, Nick, if you're going to do that, I would suggest you make an estimation first, how far the speaker is going to be in most cases from the listener, and how far the listener is going to be above the floor in relationship to the speakers. That makes sense?
But Tom, do you get screwed over by a line source that has a tweeter that's 6 feet tall?
I won't say you get screwed over, because your ear is responding to the total line source. And if you look at measurements, because I had the RD75s, it's very difficult to measure a line source, a true line source, not just a bunch of individual drivers, but a true line source. It's very difficult to measure it. And if you start taking measurements in a room of a true line source, you get all kinds of wacky things that happen. So to be honest with you, I never tried to do the same thing with my line sources, because my line sources were horizontally displaced. In other words, my RD75s are almost 7 feet tall, and then I had the 6 10-inch peerless drivers alongside it. And then I had my subwoofers in the corner. Very different situation, and every situation is different. You just got, I can't give you a firm rule. You got to get in there and you got to work it.
You know what Bob Carver has been up to, right? With his
Answer
CLS.
question. If it's a true line source, all the sound appears to come from your height, period. It's not 6 feet high, and
you are
they're all coming
correct,
from the same
Al.
point. That's your ear.
You're absolutely correct. But if you've got your line source and your mid bass array is sitting next to it, like yours and mine, in this case, it's not a vertical movement, it's a left and right movement for the time alignment. Because you don't have the line array sitting above your mid bass drivers. They're sitting side by side. So it's like, unless you put your line array horizontal and your mid bass horizontal below it or above it, what I'm talking about doesn't work. What I'm talking about is primarily the 80% or 90% of the speakers where the drivers are in a vertical array.
And not only that, but they are point source models.
That is correct.
Yep.
Well, they are point source, except like in mine, I've got two 12-inch drivers. So
at their frequency range, they're effectively a point source, aren't they?
That's exactly right. They're so far down that they act like a point source.
Right.
They're not a true point source, but acoustically they behave like it.
I have planers, and they're dipoles, and they have ribbon mid tweets, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I've gone by. I haven't gone to the depths that you have, but I've gone by the assumption that I put in a pulse of some kind. I gotta hear a pulse of some kind. All right. It's not perfect, and line sources, mine are 5 feet tall, whatever. Not as floor to ceiling as the model is supposed to be. But if you get a pulse out for a pulse in, you can use that to look at time differences.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
that works.
The type of driver that you talk about when using this technique, since you sort of get a pulse out for a pulse in, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, let me put it to you this way. Whatever you do in trying to get the time alignment is going to be better than nothing.
Yeah.
Unless the manufacturer has made those assumptions, like I just mentioned to Nick, where the position is going to be vertically in relationship to the speaker, and how far back they're going to be from the speaker. If you make those assumptions and you do it correctly, it'd probably be pretty close for most people. But if you just have a typical speaker with a woofer and a mid-range and a tweeter on a flat baffle, you're going to lose a lot of that.
Yep.
So I was always under the impression that you had to be a certain distance away from the speaker in order to get that integration of sound that you're talking about. So it's only when you get closer and closer and closer, really too close, that you have a problem. That at some point, let's say 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet, it doesn't matter. You don't know initially whether it's 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet, but that there is a point beyond which integration isn't a big issue. All right. For example, if I'm sitting 20 feet away from the speaker versus 6 feet, integration isn't a big issue at 20 feet. But where in terms of space does it begin to matter?
You know, I can't, again, I'm not an acoustician, I'm not a speaker scientist, but if you have a speaker where, let's say you have 3 drivers, you have a tweeter, a mid, and a woofer, and they are out of alignment, the waveform that comes out of them is going to be timed differently if their acoustic centers are different. And no matter how far back you go, that relationship is going to hold true. Now, you're absolutely correct. As you move closer, you actually have a difference between your ear and each of the drivers that's more significant. In fact, if you put your ear right next to the, 6 inches from the mid-range, and now the distance to the woofer and the tweeter are going to be much worse. And I'm not suggesting you try to do a time alignment for that, because you don't want to be sitting there for your speakers for a lot of reasons. But if you have, let's say you have 3 rabbits, okay? And they all start a race, and they all run at the same speed. The speed of the rabbits is consistent like the speed of sound. But they start from different positions. And whether you are 20 feet away from the rabbits or you're 50 feet away from the rabbits, the one that started first is going to get to you first, and the one that started last is going to get to you last. So if you are at a reasonable distance away from the speaker, then the trig is not as important as the ultimate spacing between the drivers. When you start getting closer, then you got to, start doing some trig and see how much worse it gets, with the difference in the timing reaching you as you start to get really close. That would be a problem like with if you're in a studio and you're doing close monitoring with some, monitors, that can have a bigger effect. But if the sound starts at different times from each of the drivers, no matter how far back you get, since they all, I'm saying we're out in the outside, there's no walls, there's no reflection, and you're up at 10,000 feet on a big stand, and you send a pulse out, and whether you are 50 feet away, 100 feet away, 200 feet away, 500 feet away, those 3 signals that started at different times are all traveling at the speed of sound, and they will all arrive at your position with the same time differences when they started. So now what you're talking about, Nick, I think that's important. The further you get back, the more you tend to integrate the sound, but the timing is going to stay the same because that's a function of the speed of sound and the distance.
Well, at some
Got
point,
another-
you're going to move from the direct field to the reverberant field, where the sound doesn't change very much once you're in the reverberant field.
Yeah, but I was just mentioning to Nick, that's why we're on the outside on an infinite, no reflection. But you're absolutely correct. At some point, the reverberant sound. Well, and that's again why room treatment is so important. The reverberant sound really starts to either, cover some of the problems or make some of them worse. They will never solve the original problem.
Right.
I've got another monkey wrench to throw in, if I may.
Wait a minute, let me get my hard hat.
Lenny Plotkin and I were talking about recording the Boston Symphony Orchestra. We all know, and from my write-up of our last meeting that I was in, they were talking about the multi microphones that are used in the hall by the hall people that do their recording every time. The sound arrives at all these microphones if they're anywhere near each other at different times. Lenny was saying that he knows of a recording or two of the Boston Symphony from further back, like 10 rows back, right, Lenny?
People will know this. Years ago, Mika Shatner did, I'm sure Al remembers this. Mika did a recording. We had the whole shootout with Ben Sander of the Resurrection, and he used two AK-14s. AK-14s. I remember 15 rows back, and if you remember that shootout, we had everybody under the sun recorded that, and they, I think they liked Ken Dean's recording, and Mika's the best. And I was telling Gary about that. I still have that recording. In fact, I play it all the time. It's never left my side. That's what Gary's referencing. I don't know. I had a friend of mine. He's in Boston right now, and he's never been to the Boston Symphony. He went. The guy will never be the same. But he did send me a picture of Symphony Hall, and it looks like there's still a forest of microphones there. So I'm assuming after all these years, CRB or GBH, whoever's recording hasn't changed their microphone technique any.
The point being, the point being, it doesn't matter how closely your speakers are aligned if the signal that is shoved into them comes from so many different microphones, so many different timings.
It would even be, even if you only had two microphones, if they're spaced apart, then you're getting the same wave fronts arriving at different times at the two microphones. And that is the most common method of recording stereo in almost all US recordings. That's the American style.
You are all 100% correct. What I'm talking about is not going to change what was on the recording. I am not going to be able to take a recording that was multi-mic'd or improperly recorded and make it sound right. But if the speakers are not time aligned, whatever you're feeding to it is going to be worse.
If we grant that assumption, which I tend to, is your playback system set up so that in effect you can turn it on and off to compare how much it's doing for you?
What do you mean about the playback system?
The DSP.
Well, okay. Right. Do you have like a big switch that you can pull and compare what it's like to hear things in your room through your speakers without the time alignment processing or versus with it?
Yes. What you do in the...
No, okay, excuse me. Could I just
go ahead.
Right away? I would expect you to find that some recordings benefit from it considerably more than other recordings do. Is that your experience?
Absolutely. But even the recordings that are not good don't get worse, is the point I'm trying to make. There's no doubt if you have a bad recording, it's still going to be flat, two-dimensional, doesn't matter. But it won't be worse. So I have some recordings. I have a friend that did a lot of recordings for NPR. And I have some original recordings where he used two DPA mics. And the sense of depth is great. It is absolutely better when things are time aligned and in a room that's treated than when it's not time aligned. And by the way, David, the way I can do that is in the DSP, I would create a file where everything was the same, except I don't have time alignment. And then I save another file where everything is exactly the same with time alignment. And you go back and forth And
Yeah, that's the moral equivalent. I agree.
right. And that's why I'm saying that kind of thing is a lot easier to do than physically moving the drivers around back and forth.
Sure. I guess many of us are old enough to remember Dynaquad, and right, and that there was a big difference in the effect of that add-on depending on how the recording you're listening to was made. And in particular, if there's a stereo recording method called Bloomline, which is two figure eight microphones crossed at 90 degrees between the main axes, and that the Dynaquad system seemed to like that method, and I would expect your system to like that as well, because it's a coincident stereo mic arrangement without spot mics and without outriggers and so on. It seems to me is one of the few recording techniques that's really aimed at delivering a time-aligned recorded signal. But that accounts for such a small percentage of commercially available recordings,
Absolutely correct.
especially in this country. So
my MS recordings that Tom likes so much are done with single point technique as well, if you think about it.
Right, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, the Harrison School recordings, you did a masterful job. They're really good. I will
a simple
say, though,
mic attached to the recorder, an MS mic capsule.
I will say that if you take, I was just watching a documentary on Asia, the album Asia, and how they were producing it. Fascinating. And I went back and I listened to Asia on my system, and I can tell you that it's not a perfect recording by any means. It's a typical commercial recording. But listening to that through the system that is time aligned, and with the sharp slopes, there's an amazing sense of the performers and the instruments that I did not get in the past before I had did all those changes. And I think that's the thing when people come in here and listen to the system, they're not listening to audiophile recordings when they come here. They want to hear the Beatles, they want to hear Steely Dan, they want to hear, Queen, and they're all amazed at what is on those commercial recordings, even though they will not compare to some of these recordings that my friend did, that are just two mics and big spaces and stuff. There's no comparison.
When you're talking about Asia, did you mean the rock and roll band Asia?
I meant Steely Dan. That's her album, Asia.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was. It was Donald Fagen and who's the other guy? Walter Becker, and they did a good documentary on making the different ones, and they talked especially about making the album Asia.
Spelled AHJA?
AJA. Steely Dan. AJA. Yeah. It was a huge hit back, I guess it was in the 70s, 76 or something. But that's what I'm saying is you have all these commercial recordings, and they're not going to sound like some of the better, recorded materials, but they still sound different, and they sound clean. Distinction in the voices, distinction in the instruments, the transients and the plucking of the strings, all the things that people come here and they say, oh boy, that sounds like they're right there. Is it as good as some of the recordings you're talking about, David? No, absolutely not. But I listen to a lot of that music. I don't listen to just purist recordings. And if you can take a regular commercial recording and make it sound better, to me, that's a win. Because I would say probably 90% of the recordings I listen to are not audiophile style recordings. I like the music.
Yep.
Okay, I have a small presentation to make, and that's on the whole subject of 32-bit recording. We've talked about it on and off for some time. And so over the time, I found a YouTube presentation on the benefits of 32-bit recording that I thought most of you would like to see. It lasts 10 minutes, which is long. But anyway, we only have about 45 minutes left anyway.
Let's do
I
it.
thought I'd present it and see, because most of us have done or do recording. And most of us do not use 32-bit to do recordings. However, as we all know, Zoom and a few other people have come out with recorders that handle 32-bit with no issues. And I don't use 32-bit recording regularly. One, because I usually record live and the background noise is usually so bad anyway, it doesn't make much difference. However, I think I might switch to 32-bit because one of the major advantages of 32-bit recording is you never have to set the volume control because you never overload. Now, I see David shaking his head.
Yeah, that's totally wrong.
Okay. Well, let's.
And the whole 32-bit thing with consumer recorders is, I would say, 80% fraudulent.
Okay,
Al, before you start, I just want to make a reference if anybody's interested in 32-bit. And there was a presentation that was done by the AES of somebody, I can't remember her name. It's a woman who teaches at some university in Scotland, and said, why do you need 32-bit DACs? Not the recording. And the reason they came up with, after a lot of investigation, is if you have a 32-bit DAC, you can use the DAC for volume control. And other than that, having 32 bits in a playback is kind of...
Right. That's not my argument. My argument is in the recording menu.
Yes. I just wanted to mention, if you folks are interested in your AES members, you can find that. It was a fascinating presentation about DACs.
Well, David, after the presentation, I want to hear your arguments.
Okay, I'll be here.
Can we see it?
Yep.
Okay, I'll get it started.
32-bit float really useful, or is it just a marketing gimmick? Let's talk about it. Hey, Julian Grass here, and there seems to be a bit of confusion regarding 32-bit float right now. You might ask yourself, why is 32-bit float coming up again when we already had it for years? What's the benefit anyways, and do you really need it? Straight up, I want to show you what's possible with 32-bit float that you simply cannot achieve with 24 or 16-bit audio formats. After that, I'll show you where this might come in handy, and also spoiler that in most cases, you actually do not need 32-bit float for audio recording, but I'll get to that soon enough. Here I have a sine wave, and I'm going to digitally amplify it so that the audio goes above 0 dBFS. Then I'll save it in 16-bit, 24-bit, and 32-bit float. After that, I'll pull back down the audio again, and you can see that in the 32-bit float format, all the signal is retained. You still have a nice sine wave. Compare this to 16 and 24-bit, where the audio is clipped and not recoverable. That's because for the standard 16 and 24-bit audio formats, there's a maximum level the audio can go to, also known as 0 dBFS. FS standing for full scale, and when a signal tries to go above this level, it simply gets cut off. This is clearly not the case for 32-bit float, and
He's already lying, but I'll shut up now.
You never clips. But there's a bit more to that, and I will get into that a little later. For now, the takeaway is that with a 32-bit float, we can restore audio above 0 dBFS, which prevents clipping, while non-float formats like 16 and 24-bit cut off the audio above 0 dBFS. Let's have a look at the other end of the scale. Let's start out with a sine wave again, but this time I decrease the amplitude by 130 decibels and save it as 16 and 24-bit as well as 32-bit float. Now I bring the audio back up again to the original amplitude, and you can see that the 32-bit float file kept the wave remarkably clean, whereas the 24-bit audio introduced quite a bit of distortion, and the 16-bit file simply wasn't able to store any audio data at all. We could have improved the situation a bit if we used dither, but that's beyond the scope of this video. But overall, it makes sense. You only have a certain amount of data available, and when the signal gets smaller and smaller, there comes a point where there are simply no more bits left to store the signal. I know, these are deliberately fabricated scenarios. In the real world, you likely never need to boost your audio by 130 decibels. But it goes to show that there is a limit on how strong or soft a signal can get before it cannot be stored anymore in an audio format. This range from the smallest possible signal to the strongest one is usually expressed as a ratio, and that's what is referred to as dynamic range. And by the way, it has nothing to do with low or high frequencies, so the pitch of the sound. It is all about the amplitude. When comparing bit depth, you will inevitably come across this picture, which compares the dynamic ranges of the different formats. And you can see exactly what I demonstrated with the experiment before. 16-bit has the lowest dynamic range, 24-bit has quite a bit more, and a 32-bit float has an incomprehensibly huge dynamic range. With each bit more, you increase the dynamic range by about 6 decibels, and that's why 24-bit has about 48 dB more dynamic range than 16-bit. But you might have noticed that 32-bit float is a lot bigger than 24 bits, and that's due to the float format. I will spare you the technical details here, but the float part essentially allows the decimal point to float, and that can increase the resolution tremendously compared to non-float formats. I'm simplifying here, but the important part is that the dynamic range of 32-bit float is huge, and it can store the tiniest signals and even ones that exceed 0 dBFS. This increased precision can be really useful when audio processing because there are complex calculations that take place, and in these cases you want to retain a huge range of signal amplitudes. And that's the reason why we've been using 32-bit float in audio programs for years now in the editing and processing stage. What's new now is that a 32-bit float is used as a format in which audio interfaces and sound recorders save the audio to. So 32-bit float is not a new tech, it's actually quite old, but it's new in the sense that it is now used as a recording format. Now, here's the part where people often get confused about. And before we dive in, please like this video and subscribe if you enjoyed it so far. Many audio devices that are capable of 32-bit float are advertised to successfully prevent clipping. One might think that 32-bit float is responsible for that, but that's not totally correct. I mean, it can play a role, as I showed you earlier. You essentially can't clip anymore when the signal is already in the digital domain. But if we are talking about audio recording, there are many more things in the audio chain that can limit your dynamic range. For example, your microphone will have a certain amount of dynamic range. The preamp and of course the analog to digital converter found in the recording device also has a certain amount of dynamic range. So just because you save your audio into 32-bit float does not mean that you cannot clip somewhere else in the signal chain. But it does at least eliminate the format that the audio is saved in as a potential bottleneck. One more important point to add, 32-bit float does not sound better than 24-bit if both are used correctly. In fact, in the majority of situations, they are audibly indistinguishable. It's just that with 32-bit float, you have a bit more convenience in post-production. That also means that a 32-bit float is not a magic solution that makes everything sound awesome. You will still have to practice proper audio recording technique and care as much about mic placement and similar things as with 24-bit. If you record shitty audio, it will sound shitty in 32-bit float as well. But why is it now that 32-bit float recorders are advertised with being impossible to clip? Well, usually these devices not only feature 32-bit float, but some kind of additional technology which enables the device to capture a higher dynamic range than normally possible. One of these techniques, for example, is the use of multiple analog to digital converters, which when combined can capture a very high dynamic range. I actually already made a video about this topic if you're interested. And this is actually the reason why these devices don't clip anymore, because they simply capture everything from the softest to the loudest signal. Now you will say, great, and this is where 32-bit float makes sense, because it can hold the huge dynamic range you can capture with multi-ADC setups. Well, but so can 24-bit, because in reality, with dual or triple ADC setups, you still likely do not get a dynamic range that exceeds what 24-bit can handle. And even if it could, it is highly questionable if you would ever need this amount of dynamic range. Think about it, 140 dB SPL is the threshold of pain, which means that the sound is so loud that you get physical pain from the audio, and you are forced to cover your ears. And you can capture these loud signals and everything all the way down to 0 dB SPL, which is where sounds just become audible. This is already an insane range of amplitudes you can capture with 24-bit. Is hardly a benefit when it comes to audio recording. And by the way, not needing to set your gain with 32-bit float is another benefit that is often thrown into the room. But again, this is not unique to 32-bit float. If you capture a huge dynamic range, you do not need to set your gain anymore, because you simply capture everything from the very soft to very loud signals. And as mentioned before, 24-bit already covers the dynamic range big enough to handle the majority of situations. Okay, Julian, but the whole time you're essentially saying that 24-bit is already good enough to capture high-quality audio. What's the benefit of 32-bit float then? Convenience. I think the biggest advantage of 32-bit float is that while recording, you can digitally bring up the audio to a signal level which is much closer to the loudness of how you would distribute the audio. So you are more in a what you see is what you get kind of situation. With 24-bit to use the whole dynamic range, in most situations you would usually have to leave yourself a huge amount of headroom, and then the signal seems very weak. In itself, this is not a problem, but this might be more difficult to monitor, and when you go into post-production, some plugins might expect a bigger signal level to start with. With 32-bit float, you can store the audio at a stronger level, closer to what it would be in final delivery, and you still don't have to worry about clipping, as all audio above 0 dBFS is retained. In essence, recording in 32-bit float eliminates the audio format as a potential bottleneck, and it has the added convenience that once you have the signal in the digital realm, you can amplify or attenuate it to your heart's content, while always being able to retain all the audio information. The important part is that this only affects how the audio is stored, and it has no impact on the other components prior in your signal chain. Best practices in audio recording, like proper mic placement, are still as important as before. 32-bit float will not magically make anything sound better. So think of 32-bit float as a container. It can hold an incredible dynamic range, but what matters is what you put into this container. If the analog section of an audio recording device is not that great, 32-bit float is not going to improve things. This also means that not all 32-bit float recording devices are created equally. If a device supports it, it just has the potential to hold a huge dynamic range. But how much it really captures is a completely different story. So do you absolutely need 32-bit float for recording? No. 24-bit already provides more dynamic range than you probably ever need, and when used correctly, it can be indistinguishable from 32-bit float in terms of sound quality. 32-bit float simply has the advantage that you can digitally amplify the audio while recording to a level which will be closer to the final delivery loudness, and that can make monitoring the audio and using plugins and generally post-production a bit easier. That, of course, comes at the expense of a slightly increased file size. So I wouldn't say it's purely a marketing gimmick, but it's also not this crazy life-changing technology that some make it out to be. All right, like and subscribe, and I will see you all.
Why was his recording quality so bad?
What's that?
His recording quality, I was getting no high frequencies coming out of that video.
Okay. Okay.
Not enough bits, obviously.
Yeah. David Sachs, what do you got to say about that?
A couple of things. He does qualify his statements toward the end, and I appreciate that, where he says it's not a system that produces miracles, and he admits that it doesn't actually improve sound quality over properly used 24-bit. And I appreciate that as well. But he is leaving out something really important. It's what he isn't talking about that I think matters. If you, okay, so the range of sensitivity of available professional quality microphones is about 40 dB. That's to say, from the least sensitive to the most sensitive microphones you can buy for professional use. There are some that deliver about 1 millivolt per Pascal, and some that deliver 40 dB greater than that. Different experiences you might want to record, different sonic events, also have a very, very wide range of maximum sound pressure levels that you need to pick up without distortion. It's harder to put a number on that, but it might be 40 or 50 dB of difference. I mean, from a clavichord to a rocket launching. It's every microphone preamp has a noise floor which depends on the gain to which you've set the microphone preamp. And the thing that is counterintuitive for a lot of recordists when they start recording, you would think that if you turn the gain up, you're going to get more noise. And yes, you do, but not more by the same amount that you've turned the gain up. In general, most mic preamps are at their quietest when you set the gain to the maximum level that isn't going to clip for your particular microphones and recording situation. And that goes totally against what most people would expect, but it's consistent, measurable, provable. I wasn't prepared to be asked about this, but if necessary, I could bring you charts and graphs and show what I mean. So there is no possibility of one gain setting fits all microphones and all recording venues and situations and still delivers the lowest noise that microphone preamp is capable of delivering. It's simply impossible by a large factor. Okay, so if you allow your recorder to determine the gain setting of its built-in mic preamps, and if that recorder is designed so that it essentially never clips in real-world situations, then guaranteed the mic preamps are adding up to 20 dB more noise than they would have to if you were to set your levels according to the sensitivity of your mics and the maximum sound levels that you're intending to pick up. And that's the thing he's not addressing at all. Of course, as a numeric storage medium, 32-bit does have wider dynamic range by a lot, but you're feeding it a signal that has to come in through the mic preamps, and they're not cooperating with that idea. So you definitely for live recording, you need to be able to adjust the gain of the mic preamps. The rest of it, that's fine with me if you want to use 32-bit, but it won't gain you anything. Except, well, you know, if you badly... There are some configurations, some situations, and some mic preamps that might have a great deal more headroom than the input of the A to D converter in that recorder. And in that case, well, no, you're going to clip the A to D converter anyway if the mic preamp gain is set too high. Thing to understand is that the A to D converter is generating a linear PCM output in most cases. And then that gets numerically converted to a floating point numeric format.
Can I ask a question of everybody? Does anybody know of a true 32-bit floating point converter, i.e. the output?
God, no. There is no A to D converter with more than about a 22 dB range in the world.
I'm not talking about the range. I'm talking about the internal conversion mechanism. I don't know of any converter that by nature produces a 32-bit floating point output. My take on it is they've been using 24 and there exists 32-bit converters, but then they're converting that to a floating point signal, a floating point value, I should say. Is that true?
Yeah.
You all agree?
As far as I know, but I think I know.
Handles 32-bit wave signals very well. And so does the recording system, which software, which is probably the most wide known across the world, Reaper. They easily, and most professional software handles 32-bit recordings. I don't understand.
Okay.
Oh, that's where the whole push came from. Is because the work, okay, like for a professional sound recordist, let's say, who's doing film sound, okay, they spend a day on the set and they turn their files over to the producer who runs them through this workflow, which all the editing and the sound modification and the mixing is done by a whole other crew of people. And then the live talent and the recordist goes on to another day to capture more material. But the workflow on the back end is 32-bit. Okay, so of course it's an advantage for them. If they can deliver the files in 32-bit format already, then they don't need to be converted.
Let's be more precise. I'm sorry. 32-bit floating point.
Yes, that's what we're talking about.
32-bit floating point as a container, as a means of transferring information is what's required when you do lots of computation in the audio workstation or whatever thing you're doing, because you don't want to lose the precision of computation by rounding errors when you have fixed point, and with fixed point you can experience overflows and underflows and things like that. Those give you worse sound. So 32-bit floating point as a means of storing the information, hands down, no question. But for generating 32-bit floating point in the converter as a natural thing, I don't know of any that exist, and I don't see the need for it. As he said, 24-bit is more than enough to capture the entire dynamic range from totally quiet to pain.
And if I could just interject for a second, what David was talking about in terms of what you can expect in terms of maximum SPLs at performances. I've gone to a lot of performances by the the Pennsylvania, the Philadelphia Orchestra and some other orchestras in this area. And with me, I bring this little Dayton Audio microphone that I have calibrated. I have a microphone calibrator that'll calibrate both at 94 dB and 100 and I forgot what it is. So it's a calibrated mic, and I have measured peaks no matter what area I was in the hall and what orchestra. I have measured consistently peaks that run from 100 to 106 dB. Now, if you look at that, that's as loud as I've measured. And then you look at the background hall noise, you can see that as far as the initial recording, you don't need 32-bit. I mean, that's not 32 bits worth of dynamic range. So, but I agree in the processing stage, that could be of great benefit.
Yeah, no one would argue that, okay, let's say the microphone is well known, the first more or less standard is roughly, their Omni microphone is around 138, 140 dB dynamic range. So you would want a recorder that you don't need a recorder that can pick that up. But if you had a recorder that can pick up a signal much lower, much higher than that, then you'd gain. Remember, the only advantage, as we all agree to 32-bit, is not having to fool with your volume control, David. And I think that's what we're saying.
And that's what's false. That is specifically the thing that's false. And unfortunately, a lot of people do believe it, but it is provably false.
Okay, all I know is when I record anything with any machine and any microphone, I ask them to play as loud as they're going to be playing ever in the performance, and I make sure I don't pin the needle. Where can I go wrong there?
Yeah, you're not gonna.
Except that when we all do recording, and we want, at least particularly if you grew up in the tape age or the cassette age, and I grew up in the tape age, and where your level was super critical.
Right.
In fact, we all can remember records that were made where when it got to the loud parts, they turned down the volume of the concert on the recording or the tape recorder, which we no longer have to do with the invention of digital and whatever. And 32-bit says that, and this demo that I just showed didn't show you, the other one I looked at did, of how they took a regular recording and, playing at the usual levels, whatever, and how on the 24-bit recorder, they were playing so loud, again, because that's the way the person initially set the volume controls, that it clipped. But on the 32-bit recording, it wasn't clipped. So the entire concert was saved.
Okay, so that's a matter of your gain level.
Huh?
I'm sorry. That's the first place where this guy was pulling the wool over people's eyes, is when he was showing the clipped waveforms with the linear 16 and 24-bit, and then the unclipped waveform for 32-bit.
Yeah.
Okay. Think about that. You can, first of all, floating point absolutely does have an overload limit. It's just that you can set it wherever you want in relation to the overload limit of a linear system like 16 or 24. And they happen to have set it so that their limit was way above the limit of the 16 and 24. And therefore they didn't clip in that demonstration.
Mm-hmm.
But every microphone has noise. Every venue, as you pointed out, has noise, but the noise, he's using like 0 dB. First of all, is not quite correct that that's the threshold of hearing. And second of all, no available professional microphone has a noise floor that low. So even if you could find a venue in which music would be pleasant to listen to, and it could be performed there, and you could record it, you're not going to get a 0 dB noise floor out of the microphone. Just isn't going to happen. The quietest microphones that I'm aware of have a noise floor in the area of 12 to 15 dB, reasonably weighted. A weighting doesn't count down that low. A weighting is the specification most microphone manufacturers love to give because it makes their microphones appear to be 10 dB quieter than they really are. Okay, but in actual proper weighting and time averaging, the noise floor of the quietest microphones I've ever that I know of are above 10 dB and generally above 12 dB SPL. So that's your noise floor. You want your recording medium to be a few dB lower than that so that it's not adding any audible noise. So it's great if your mic preamps had their equivalent noise at the 0 dB level, but the only way you can get that is by turning up the gain on the mic preamp as high as you can without clipping it. And that's the thing, that's the step that's completely left out of this discussion on the video.
That's why I don't really care about noise floor. I care about peaks overloading my recording.
Well, if there was a 20 dB extra noise added to your recording, I think you would care about it. It didn't have to be there.
What could I do about it?
That is likely to be the case. With 32-bit recorders using the mic preamps, and there's no gain setting on those mic preamps, there are definitely going to be situations in which 20 dB of noise is being added to the recording that would not have to be there.
How would I hear a noise floor unless I turned it up on playback to 140 dB or something ridiculous?
Well, some people actually do that, and they're called audiophiles.
And after a while, they're called deaf.
Yeah, no, okay, this is an opinion statement, but I think it's desirable to have as low a noise floor on a recording as you can practically get, because even when you're not consciously hearing it, it has an effect on the listening quality of a recording. And just as an engineer, I don't want to add noise unnecessarily if I can avoid it. If I'm not giving up some other quality of the recording, I want to keep the noise to a minimum in the medium.
It will automatically be as low as possible if you keep the peaks just below the maximum that you can record.
Correct.
All right.
But that step is being skipped with these recorders.
Well, I know that Zoom was at a F6.
F6 is correct.
Does have little volume controls. You can adjust the gain. They say you don't have to. I think a lot of people don't use them, but as I recall, you can adjust the gain.
That's correct.
And do you know where that gain adjustment is acting? That's
No.
important.
No, I don't know.
It needs to be toward the front end.
Yep. Just for a broad response, I will tell you about my recording experience. First of all, I use Zoom and Tascam recorders. They're digital. They'll do 16-bit. They'll do 24-bit. I've done both. I can't tell the difference because of maybe how I record. I adjust my volume levels at the outset to avoid clipping. But here's what I've learned. When I've tried the experiment of asking the orchestra, let's say, play at the loudest level you can. Okay, I can set my volume controls. If I set them to 1 dB below clipping, that's a big mistake. That's
right.
In my experience, I would now start with 6, but even that's not enough because what I've observed is that if I set it at 6, they come out and their first loud passage is at -3, and by the end of the concert they're excited. So they're jazzed, I think, when they start up, and so they're playing louder than what's supposed to be their loudest. And at the end of the concert, they're playing even louder than that.
That's right.
And I had one concert where the difference was like 15 dB. I kid you not. Wow. This was the weirdest thing I ever saw. It was a cellist who played with a piano and a drum. And at the end of the concert, they were playing rock and roll, and I mean Jimi Hendrix. And the cellist was on his back on the stage, and the drums were pounding the crap out of the drums. And it was really 15 dB, and I had to cut gain as I went through that concert. I could just cut the gain by a dB. Damn it, another dB. Damn it. And that's what I've observed. I found 16 dB is plenty enough range, but you got to start off about 10 dB down.
Yeah, musicians who aren't fully warmed up are very reluctant to play loud. So when you ask them for a sample of loud, they're not going to give you all that they're going to give by the time they get to that place in the performance. And it's just a mental. I am a classical musician, and it's a kind of a mental trap. They can't give you the level that you're asking them for.
Good to know. Thank you.
Yeah.
And drums are a crazy thing to record anyway, as far as dynamic range goes. I adore percussion ensembles. And that was like when I first got a PCM F1, I got to record a live percussion ensemble. And for the first time, I had something approaching real dynamics of a group like that. I listened to it again and again. It was just so fun. But percussion has unusual dynamic range requirements.
Yep.
The interesting thing, I don't record, by the way, but the interesting thing that I've found with well-recorded drum kits, I have found that if you take the kick bass, everybody expects really high peak amplitudes, which if it's recorded properly, you do get. I was amazed running the thing through Audacity that some of the cymbal strikes were almost as high as the kick bass. Now, obviously much shorter, but huge amplitude on the stick striking the cymbals.
And what's also unusual, Tom, is on cymbals, they go out to 20 kilohertz. Well,
yeah.
The frequency
so I mean, people say, why am I using so much power on the tweeter? because when you get those cymbal strikes, you can
You
clip the amplifier. This way I don't worry about clipping the amplifier, but I was shocked. I never would have bet that those high frequency signals could be the peak amplitude very close to like a kick bass.
That's correct. That's correct. That's correct.
Yep.
Okay, it's almost 2 hours. So what else? But I will conclude, David, that it's a convenience, and I've recorded with 32-bit, and I don't even see my needles move on the recorder at all. They're not moving.
That's not good.
To my
That's not good.
my
Turn it off.
edition editor, I just crank up the gain and I don't hear any extra noise, nothing.
Yeah, because you're not hearing what the recording would have sounded like if you had recorded it with more gain in the mic preamps. So
Not
the
quite
comparison
sure.
that you're making by cranking up the gain digitally is not the comparison that I suggest needs to be made. You need to know how quiet, what would the noise floor of that recording have been with approximately correct gain in the mic preamps.
Well, since I use mainly the multi-channel microphone, the
Sound field.
the noise floor of the sound field is what, 20 dB.
It's more than that. Yeah. Mhm.
That's higher than most microphones, but a microphone is like a loudspeaker. It can have 0 dB output. It can be infinitely quiet.
No, that's completely
No.
false.
No.
That's a wrong statement, but it can be much quieter than an electronically driven microphone.
Just for comparison, my measurement microphone for speaker testing, again, I don't record music, but I've got an ACO 7012 capsule, half-inch capsule, marvelous device. It doesn't reach 3% distortion until 140 dB, but on the bottom end, I was trying to measure the noise floor in my room, which is acoustically treated and isolated. And when I started getting down around 25, 26 dB, I was running into the microphone. It's the problem. If I'm going to go below that, I need maybe a 1-inch capsule or something. But so I don't see a typical microphone getting down anywhere below 20 dB for the bottom of the noise floor. Now, as you know, David, you've run into some that are down below that, but
the Shure microphones are 16 dB, and they're SM80. They're common microphones.
Yeah,
That's
In general,
weighted.
in general, measurement microphones are noisier than regular hi-fi microphones
Because they don't need to be quiet.
yeah, they don't need to be.
Yeah.
When you're measuring a speaker, it's not a problem.
Right. You're at higher levels.
Yep. And the performance at the higher levels is more important, especially if you're like trying to close mic a woofer or something.
Well,
Yeah.
also the traceability of their calibration to a recognized standard, and the possibility of having them recalibrated. There are things that you care about with measurement microphones, where studio microphones, even professional ones, they're not a primary criterion.
Right. The stability of the microphone with time, with temperature. The ACO has a stainless steel diaphragm, so it's very insensitive to a lot of other things. Probably does not lend itself to be the quietest mic, especially a half-inch mic.
Yeah,
Okay, is that about it?
that's
Until next time, we can't solve it.
Anything else we want to talk about? No?
Okay.
Oh, well. I guess we're done then.
Okay. Take care.
All right, everybody. Good speaking with you again.
Bye.